Austin, I'd like to thank you for allowing me into your homes for this 27th edition, excuse me, of Season 2 of Esoteric Science Roundtable. Today, I would like to discuss Lemuria, the ancient continent of Lemuria. One thing I would like to mention very quickly before I do start is that I will be hosting a group meditation that will be taking place on June 11th at the North Loop branch of the Austin Public Library, and that's from 7:30 to 8:30 Wednesday, June 11th, that I will be hosting a group meditation, a goodwill meditation, and there's a graphic for it, 2200 Hancock Drive, the Hancock branch of the Austin Public Library. And I would encourage everybody to come out. It would be absolutely free, and I don't want to say informal necessarily because we're going to try to get some work done, but I would encourage everybody that has an opportunity to come out to add their energy to that effort. So again, June 11th, Wednesday, June 11th, from 7:30 to 8:30, I'll be hosting this meditation. And to return to the topic at hand, Lemuria. Lemuria is the name of the continent that existed in the Pacific Ocean, a huge, huge continent, really larger than the United States at the time that it did exist, that found its way underneath the ocean. It had a volcanic cataclysm, and it sank as a result and broke up and went beneath the ocean. According to esoteric science, about 1 million years ago, we find that this great continent subsided and went underneath the ocean. And so that being the case, Lemuria is considered the first continent where life, self-conscious life, first came into being. There was human life before this took place. And to start from, to give a little bit of background on that briefly, the first great race of humans was initially called the Polarian race, and they're also known as the Will-born race. And now to consider humanity back in this far, far ancient time, millions of years ago, literally, way over, easily over 20 million years ago, and farther back than that even, that we can trace the evolution of man and also his self-conscious understanding. Because considering that initially man was far more spiritual and less material and dense in the sense that we are in this day and age. Man, he was way back in many, like again, over 20 million years ago, was a lot closer to spirit and was not nearly anywhere close to what we consider the way we look in this day and age. And this is far, far also before the division of the sexes. A long, long time ago, according to esoteric tradition, again, the first race, the Polarian, being called the Will-born, there was no procreation or sex act that was needed in order to have a baby. Basically, will-born, if you can follow that term. By just an exercise of the will, we were able to have our progeny and able to go from that point. And it wasn't as if there were men and women that had to unite in any way with this will-born approach. Everything was included in each individual. So we were what you would call androgynous at this far, far time. But really nothing even close to sex organs was available in humanity at this far, far time in our antiquity. And so we eventually moved down into our second great race, which was known as the Hyperborean race. And the Hyperborean race is a race, again, the second great race that sprang up, and it eventually makes its way gradually more into the dense material nature. And again, Hyperborean is still far, far before the division of the sexes and far, far back into our antiquity, so that it would be really difficult to even call these conditions human in the sense that we think of it today, so far removed from anything that we can even remotely describe as human for our current understanding. And so that being the case, coming to the great third race, which is the subject of today's show, the Lemurian race, the Lemurian continent, again, considering that there was at one time a huge continent that existed in the Pacific Ocean, and that there are remnants of this today that are existing, that we can see a lot of the islands that make up that far, far apart, actually thousands of miles apart, that were at one point in time part of this larger continent. Excuse me. And so following in also to describing these individuals, how they were around this time, our early humanity, our early ancestors, there is one legend from Plato that makes mention of our our early androgynous roots in the sense that, again, both sexes being contained within one entity. And there was an ancient myth or legend of ancient humanity rolling on its side to get around, and it supposedly had, you know, 4 arms and 4 legs, and again, this is just a myth, but keeping in mind that through all myth there is at least a grain or kernel of truth that this myth or story is based upon. So that being the case, this ancient myth that the humanity was poised to roll up a hill and attack a certain group, and so actually to attack the gods. The gods were fearful that humanity would roll up a hill and roll up on them basically and take over. And so for fear of this, they supposedly severed mankind into the 2 sexes, and they said now he's going to spend the rest of his time looking for his other half. And anybody that knows the term soulmate or anything along those lines might consider how that would spring from an early myth about us being 2 and 1 at one point in time, and that the sexes did ultimately split from one unit, one human unit. Although again, that far back into antiquity, you could barely relate what we were then to how we are now. We've really evolved tremendously from that time, and our physical, emotional, and mental nature has changed considerably as well. And so the Lemurian continent is also the seat of what is known mythologically as the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is the story of the origin of man, the first Adam and Eve, so that supposedly came into the world, and also the so-called fall, the fall into matter, that also ties into the Lemurian age. Allegedly, according to esoteric science, what took place was that we were, again, not really what you would consider anywhere close to humanity as we perceive ourselves today. And we were not self-conscious. We weren't thinking entities. We didn't think about ourselves, and we couldn't say I in the same sense that we can today. And that, to get into that might be a little convoluted, but basically we were not self-conscious, individualized entities. We were part of more of a group thinking, more, again, of the spiritual, more spiritual than matter. And so the senses, as far as eyesight and the physical senses, hearing and all these things, didn't evolve to the state that they are now in humanity until much later, until far later in time. And so initially during this Garden of Eden time, if we consider how humanity was, to describe in a general terms, supposedly what we looked like. Supposedly we were these huge, like 12, 15 feet tall, gelatinous looking kind of entities that again had both sexes within one, and again the offspring would come through within the unit. You would find the offspring coming out. There was not again a sex union or a union between the two entities until a little bit later, after this time of individualization, that we find the dividing of into the sexes. And this allegedly took place around 18 million years ago. And for anthropology and history and archaeology and a lot of areas of endeavor and scientific research, that seems far too fanciful for modern academia to latch onto and accept. And I would just say that if anybody's studied anything as far as like the parapolitical stuff and the New World Order kind of thing and all that, things are not always as they seem. And so for us to extend out a bit and say that history and what we've been taught as far as the origins of humanity, and again how powerful we actually are as humanity, has been held from us in many, many ways, and through all areas of human endeavor, and these branches of the sciences, that we haven't really been told the full story, and that's coming out more so and more so, that we're getting a fuller picture of how we were in this ancient time. But nonetheless, 18 million years ago, according to esoteric tradition, the self-conscious aspect came into humanity. And the legend, according to the Indian tradition, is that the Manasupatras, or the sons of mind, melded with humanity. And then also some might be familiar with more of the biblical legend of the fall as far as the Luciferic influence that came into man at that time. And we see symbolically through all the myths a merging of, whether you call it Luciferic or Manasupatra or whatever, you see a merging of a consciousness with our humanity to give us an increased ability before consciousness. And some might point back and say, well, maybe these myths are part of us, part of a myth or part of a story of some kind of alien intervention, and these Manasupatras or this Luciferic influence that came into humanity at that time was some sort of an alien influence, and there was some kind of genetic manipulation going on or something along those lines. Now, I'm not completely discounting that we may not have been tinkered with at some point in time during our history on this planet, because we've been here a long time and we've been human in some form or another for a tremendous amount of time, and we've changed drastically from what we were in those early days, again, 18 million years ago, when we were huge creatures. We didn't really resemble humanity. We didn't have our sense organs developed at that time, and we were much more spiritual and in tune and intact spiritually with the spiritual world and our spiritual nature. Again, that doesn't, just because the science doesn't agree with that doesn't mean necessarily that there's not some truth in these ancient myths, and that this merging that took place, in my estimation, was more of a merging of consciousness as opposed to splicing of genetics and a laboratory setting. I don't really consider it, in my own estimation, to be that. Although, I can't say that I'm the ultimate authority by any stretch. But nonetheless, I feel like it was more of a consciousness melding, a merging, if you will, of consciousness, kind of in the same sense that Jesus and Christ merged for 3 years' work in Palestine. A very similar situation, all things considered, as far as a merging of consciousness, a higher consciousness coming down and merging with a lower consciousness. And we also may hear the fact that some of those Luciferic entities, or these angels, did not want to merge with the lower entity man, and so they rebelled. And we find the legend of the rebelling angels because they did not want to taint their high consciousness with this low, practically what you would consider animal man, almost, for lack of a better term, although we did not resemble what we would consider animals. Our consciousness was devoid of humanity fully, and so that's why the term animal man can sometimes be used, although it's not very accurate, because again, the way we actually looked was more like a huge gelatinous kind of creature that we didn't have the bony structure at that time. That was way far before we had the bones, and we were dense as we are now. And so to get an accurate picture is very difficult, and the way that I've derived that description is either from those that have been able to read the so-called Akashic records, and those that have been able to derive from tapping into what was for their own abilities, and also what's been translated and derived through ancient religious records, the date and age of which is certainly in question, and that's just up to speculation as to whether certain people are going to deem that some of these religious records are indeed as old as they claim to be, in expanse of 10 to 50,000 years old at least. And again, that's up to certain people as to whether they're going to choose to believe that that might be the case or not. And also, one of the early legends, too, of the Lemurian races, again, keeping in mind that during any great cycle, there's going to be a division of 7 races. And so we find, ultimately, that there were 7 great divisions in the Lemurian time, and that more towards the 5th, or a little past the midpoint, did we achieve anything remotely close to what we would consider ourselves looking like now. And also at that time, the way in which mankind procreated, when we did finally become individualized, was going through a lot of experimentation at that time. And so you found a lot of variety among the races as far as what was coming into being as our humanity. And so you found very tall entities, and then even on down to what are known as pygmies were alive and thriving during this time, according to esoteric science. And so you had a wide variety of racial variation and ethnic diversity, even far, far into our antiquity. Science would have you believe that we all found our evolution through some sort of primate, and that through the ape evolution, that evolution moved forward and we ultimately became what is known as humanity. And they point back at these anthropoid skeletal fossil remains that they find, and they say, oh, this is several million years old. The Leakeys would find one, or whomever, and science and anthropology would try to put together the portrait through these fossil records of how humanity actually came into being in the evolutionary process. Esoteric science says quite a bit different, actually. What took place in actuality, according to esoteric science, and this is probably the farthest stretch I'm going to have to ask folks to try to work with me on here, is that the ape races were offshoots of humanity at one point in time. During this experimentation time, if you will, when humanity was more coming into its own, there was a wide variety of ability to have intercourse. Once again, we were individualized, and man was man and woman was woman. And then the sexes divided also among the animals as well, that you find that there was crossbreeding going on a lot, and that man at that point in time, according to esoteric tradition, could actually procreate and have sexual relations with animals. And so there were offspring as a result of that. Now, I have to make a firm statement right now. None of the existing humans on this planet are as a result of this union between animal and man. That gets thrown around a lot in different varying camps that I've heard throughout time when you start researching this thing. And I would say at now there's no human that has any kind of primate blood in them. Essentially what took place a long time ago was that we were able to procreate with different animals, and so these offshoots, these races that we see, what we see as far as these different races coming into being have to do with, they're like leftovers, if you will. The apes and things of that nature, and the chimpanzee races, they're like basically locked into their own point of evolution, and they have basically just like a little hint, if you will, remaining of when they were human from far, or had human capacity far long ago into antiquity. Now again, that's kind of a contentious or controversial statement to make, but I have to reiterate, no humans living today on the planet, I see the phone lines are blowing up, no humans today have been derived from these animal races.
Ignore the phone.
Okay. My producer's cautioning me to ignore the phone. Anyway, that being the case, though, everybody that's alive today in the human state is not derived from animals. I don't care what race you are or what ethnicity, because there's only one race. So again, that can be perceived different ways, but I don't want it to be convoluted by that aspect of it. Ultimately, there came a point in time when the races could no longer, and animals and man could no longer procreate, and that's right and fitting. And those that did try to break the law, if you want to term that as a divine law, which ultimately it is, once that division was made, those that broke the law and tried to go back and procreate with animals were rendered celibate according to esoteric tradition. And so anyone that transgressed or broke the law at that point, again, was rendered celibate. And this division of the sexes, or the divisions between the races, animal races, men, and the races of men, could no longer take place. And so we see again, like apes and chimpanzees and these races locked into a place where they could no longer advance into humanity, and so they were locked into their own evolutionary points. And we see that they're not really evolving. If you study the primates, they're not really evolving, and they don't even have what some of the other animals have, the advantage of being domesticated. So as far as the evolutionary process is concerned, like, for instance, horses and dogs, since they're domesticated and they live with humans more so than the apes and chimpanzees and things of that nature, we find that being more of a vehicle through these types of animals for humanity, for consciousness to evolve more so and more so. Because according to esoteric tradition, ultimately, from a mineral to a plant to an animal to a man, the evolutionary process makes its way through all of these conditions. But just right now, for instance, an animal is not going to be a man, and vice versa, through karma, reincarnation, those sorts of things. Man stays man, animal stays animal. Although there is evolution within the ranks, animal evolution is separate and different from human evolution, just to really hammer that point home. And so that being the case, and considering how life emerged on this continent and then spread from there, if we consider that at about 1 million years ago in the past, that the continent of Lemuria subsided, volcanic cataclysms took place, and it subsided below the water. And there was already, during that time, a thriving population on Atlantis, which was the next great continent that emerged. And so we find that as Lemuria subsides, more of Atlantis rises. Now, there were already, some of Atlantis was already rising, and the remainder of Atlantis rose as Lemuria subsided. And that's another thing, too, as far as some of the popular ideas of geology and what have you, that according to the mainstream theory, there was one great continent that drifted apart and made its way into 7 separate continents later on in our history. According to esoteric science, there was always one great continent. Excuse me, there were always several different continents. One would be the emphasis of the life force at that time, although even during the later Lemurian times, there was expansion outward. There were colonies that were leaving from Lemuria to Atlantis and to lands out from there as well. And for instance, considering Africa, Africa was not even above the water during, let's say, a million years ago. Africa was not even really above the water so much. Portions of it were, like for instance, Madagascar and different portions of Lemuria that are adjacent to Africa that are still existing. They show the proximity that existed, but the bulk of Africa didn't raise above the water until after the Atlantean time. And so as far as looking again towards the early species that are found in Africa and pointing to that as the birthplace of civilization, esoteric science does not generally agree with that. Although as far as the early races being black races or being the Aboriginal or the Samoan races, those allegedly were the earliest types of humanity. And so we see the remnants of, for instance, in Samoa, we see the remnants of these great, big people that allegedly the Lemurians were kind of large of stature. And we see all the Samoan islanders, the Samoan Islands, Hawaiian Islands, we see all the Polynesian peoples that are divided by large stretches of ocean, but yet they'll have common myths, common language, common tradition. And one of the myths that was largely held among these island peoples that are thousands of miles apart is that during during an older time, a greater age, far into antiquity, that their peoples were part of a greater country, a greater landmass, and excuse me, and that it had a cataclysm and subsided. And so we find these far remote little specks of land that have stayed above the water during these cataclysms that have, again, a common language and common blood, common ethnic qualities and things of that nature. And there was a legend among these people, on varying islands far apart, that in antiquity they came from a great continent in which a yellow race and a black race were constantly warring with one another. Now, these would not be the yellow races as far as the Oriental or the later Asian races. These did not come around until the so-called Atlantean time, although the beginnings of these races could definitely be traced through these Lemurian early societies and the divisions of ethnicity that were springing from, again, the one race, the one human race. There are always variations at any given time. And so we can see the transmission. We can follow from the breaking up of Lemuria and find the life traveling out to immigrate to other areas. And one of the areas that immigration took place to was to South and Central America, and from Lemuria to Atlantis and through South America and on over ultimately to Africa. And we find that life can make its way that way. And so also, as far as the Lemuria subsiding and the races branching out, we can see, if we're familiar with how the landscape was, from Lemuria, and I'll put together a map, hopefully in the future that I can show this better, but today I didn't really have it ready, so I'll have to try to just go with descriptions. But according to esoteric tradition, there was a huge sea in the middle of South America, and that was the Amazon Sea. And outside of that, even, there was a string of islands. And so, allegedly, supposedly, one could make one's way from Lemuria to South America, and then along these chains of islands to Africa. And so that was a predominant course of travel, according to esoteric tradition, from the west to the east, and that life did truly spring up in the west and migrate east, as opposed to springing up conversely the other way. And also the Bering Strait, the link of land that connects North America to and Alaska, ultimately to Asia, well, Russia, Asia, all that. That has been the scapegoat for all of our travels, and supposedly everybody found their, or well, pretty much everybody according to tradition, except for a few seafarers that found their way across the Bering Straits in antiquity into the North and ultimately South American continent. And that doesn't really jibe with what esoteric science mentions as far as the actuality of it. Now again, some of this has to be perhaps taken with a grain of salt, because this is a bit new to likely a lot of folks out there. But also considering too this land rising and falling. When Atlantis, the first cataclysm in Atlantis took place, that allegedly took place around 850,000 years ago. And so when you find a landmass subsiding or sinking, there has to be some equilibrium. And so water is going to rush in to fill that void. And so at this point in time, when we find the first portion of Atlantis going under the water, this would coincide with the raising also of some land in North America, as far as the St. Lawrence River Valley, the Mississippi River Valley. The state of Florida was submerged until that early cataclysm in the Atlantean days that allowed new land masses to rise up. And so the cataclysm that some might be familiar with, as far as Atlantis sinking around 12,000 years ago, was the last remnant of a once great civilization that was much larger, that was comprised of allegedly 3 separate great islands. And that the first 2 sank, and then the remaining portion, Poseidonus, was the last portion that did sink around 12,000 years ago, when that migration took place. The final migration took place from Atlantis. One interesting story in conjunction with that aspect is that Easter Island was originally part of Lemuria, and it subsided when the Lemurian continent broke apart and and went underneath the water. It did as well. But when the last portion of Atlantis sank, certain land again rose, and we find that the Easter Island rose again, and so it had been subsided for all that time, and then rose again. And we find that those trying to seek refuge after the last Atlantean cataclysm found their way to Easter Island, and they found the huge statues existing there. And there was also volcanic activity on Easter Island as well, which I believe there still is. And that being the case, that ties in also to the concept of gas belts and how that causes land to rise and subside. Rather than there being one large landmass that broke apart into several countries, we see there's a series of gas belts underneath the surface of the planet, and that these cause our fault lines, and these cause various seismic activity and the geologic activity that we're familiar with, as far as a lot of cataclysmic activity. And these gas belts, when they find their way to the surface, you're either going to find new land rising or land sinking. And that's constantly the case with these pockets of gas, and that how they're going to cause land to rise or subside at any given time. And that idea of the gas pockets is not that popular. It was first brought out, to the best of my knowledge, in the early 30s by an individual named James Churchward. And he showed how these gas pockets, he showed the lines of the gas pockets and traced their origins, and to how they, again, would cause a land to rise or subside. And again, he wrote a whole series, and I'd like to describe a bit about his early discoveries into the ancient continent of Lemuria. This individual, James Churchward, was in Burma in the mid-20s, let's say, and he was working with famine relief at that time. And he met in Burma an old rishi, or an old priest, an old Indian from the Indian religion, the Hindu religion. He met an old priest, and this priest found that James Churchward was very interested in ancient language and ancient culture and civilization, and entrusted to this rishi were these clay tablets They were called Nacal tablets, Naacal tablets. And they were made out of clay, and they were pictogram clay tablets, and they resembled quite a bit what we see through the Mayan civilization and culture and their pictorial representations and also their language. The language of the Mayans, or those that populated the Yucatan Valley in antiquity, is the same as this language that was brought forward on these glyphs or these clay tablets by James Churchward. And there was an individual here in Austin as well back during that time named William Niven. And this guy was in Austin, and he found 2,600 of these clay tablets in Mexico, and he found them in various depths. And he also ties them into these ancient people. And that being the case, I consider that the Mayans and those people that populated Central America and South America were the remnants of these ancient civilizations. And then we find that these tablets were either, I'm not sure if they were Lemurian specifically or if they were Atlantean specifically, but I think it would be safe to say that these tablets are at least 50,000 years old. And again, that wouldn't really fly so much with contemporary scientific ideas, but esoteric science and science don't always see eye to eye, but we do see traditional contemporary science finally catching up with esoteric science and exonerating esoteric science and showing that a lot of these things that have been alleged for a long, long time are actually true. And so we see mainstream science reflecting what has been mentioned in esoteric science for many, many, many long years. And so that's good to see that finally merging. And also, the language itself that was reflected on these tablets was called Naga or Maya as well. And again, the pictograms were supposedly by this rishi were taught. So the translation was taught allegedly to James Churchward, and working in conjunction with William Niven here in Austin, were able to corroborate their ideas on these ancient tablets, the ancient people that this area that provided. And so that being the case, these tablets provide for us a lot of clues into the science of these ancient peoples, the civilization, the language, and we see that people were far more civilized and cultured into antiquity than we might realize. Also, another thing too that science doesn't really accept so much is the fact that the dinosaurs, not just the mastodons and not just the more of the mammalian type of ancient animals, were around contemporary with man or existing at the same time as man, but that the actual dinosaurs themselves were existing at the time of the Lemurian civilizations. And so a relatively high state of civilization among humanity was reached with these dinosaurs still being on the earth in large numbers. And there are stories also, again, as to how much credence you can put into them, of the Atlantean societies having to deal with these great beasts and having to kind of do population control on them, if you will, as far as using their high advanced technology to keep these great beasts into check. And so that, again, might be subject to some speculation. But nonetheless, if we really want to trace our origins, certainly if you want to go to contemporary science and what anthropology and archaeology and all this has to offer, it's going to be very different from what I'm alleging. Now, again, I think a grain of faith and taking this with some, just not taking this without some thinking is a good way to go, because this is probably new to some folks. Another thing I want to bring up too, we find in the ancient civilizations much homage being paid to the sun and much reverence being paid to the sun. The sun, through all antiquity, through all ancient civilizations and societies, whether that be the Lemurian, Atlantean, or on into what became of the Aryan races, the set of great races that came up after the Atlantean. And keeping in mind, Aryan does not refer to white. The first Aryan race was the Indian race, the Hindu race. And so that being the case, and also to Egyptian, Babylonian, all these come from the so-called Aryan root race. And so there can be some misconceptions as far as that goes as well. But these cycles of great races, we can follow the transmission from the culture and from the migrating out into how things are currently. And also, too, the time factor. The time that it took initially when we were first becoming self-conscious around 18 million years ago to the time that we started developing the senses, hearing and the sense of smell and all these, and eyesight ultimately lastly came into being, that the fact that these senses worked their way in, they really weren't so specialized back then. I mean, it took actually relatively recently in humanity's history have we developed these senses. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. There was a long transmission process for us to build in this capacity that we have now. And the evolutionary process continues. But initially, the time period of evolution for these great cycles, for the Lemurian cycles, took a tremendous amount of time. And then the Atlantean time also was great, but less than the Lemurian. And so also we see the Aryan race now and its various sub-races that we're part of in our world today. We see that wrapping up and culminating a lot faster and quicker than the previous succession of races. And that's part and parcel of human evolution, human consciousness speeding up, and our understanding becoming fuller, that the process is quickened and sped up considerably, and so that we'll find our way through the remaining portions of this Aryan race, and then we'll begin to embark upon a sixth race. And that will allow further unfolding of consciousness. And supposedly the sixth race is the race in which nothing will be hidden and all things will come to light, and man will be not necessarily all-knowing, but that will be more akin to a golden age or an Aquarian age in which much sharing takes place, and high technology will find its way back into being for the benefit of mankind, and not to enslave mankind as some would hope that it would find its way. And so we're really at that pivotal point right now as to how things are going to progress for the remaining portion of our Aryan race, which has a considerable amount of time left to go on it. Easily, several thousand years on up to tens of thousands of years, potentially to culminate into what would be called the sixth race. But again, keeping in mind that the time is quickening and lessening, so likely thousands of years is closer to actuality than tens of thousands of years. And so things have sped up tremendously during that short amount of time. And also, let's see, keeping in mind too that, there are some races that have become extinct that were part of our previous history, that were human but are no longer around, and that would be the Tasmanian people is one example in particular. And just as there are so many species of animals that are no longer around, they're extinct. The dodo bird is extinct, for instance, and many other that we can, certainly the dinosaurs are extinct. And we see life moving through these cycles and perfecting itself and finding the vehicles that are proper for that point in evolution. And so we'll see, too, that there'll be a further opportunity for us to take advantage of evolution. And if we study, or if we pay attention to current events, you'll see from time to time that new insect races were found, or new this or new that. New aspects of our evolution are understood more so and more so, and we see the diversity and we see the potential of evolution. And I think as time goes by, that Darwinism and all that will certainly fall by the wayside in favor of a divinely inspired idea or concept of evolution, and that there is a divine law and divine spiritual impulse that finds its way into our material world and that works its way through matter, ultimately finding its way back into spirit. And our race right now, the point that we've reached right now, has already passed that midpoint of the densest, lowest point, and so we're already back on the upswing into the spiritual aspect. And that is part and parcel of the opportunity that we have to take advantage of right now, that there's so much available for us, so many rapidly developing incidents worldwide are taking place, that it can be a little bit breathtaking and overwhelming. But it's all part of the evolutionary process, and it just shows how we've come from this ancient time, if you want to consider self-consciousness or individualization, from 18 million years ago until now. That's quite a long period of time for humanity to have been doing its thing. Even our current Aryan races, again, the first cultural portion of that springing up was the Indian so-called cultural age. The origins of our current Aryan dispensation supposedly started around 1 million years ago. So with the subsiding of Lemuria around 1 million years ago, we see the raising of the fifth great continent, or the great culture on the continents existing at that time. And so again, that exchange takes place. And even the continent of Lemuria at one point supposedly had around 64 million individuals on it. And so, again, that's somewhat subject to speculation because that was a long time ago. But I think that these ancient religious records and people's individual research will find its way to mainstream thinking more so. Even considering Stonehenge, too, the background that I have up right now, those ancient people, the Druids were remnants of the Atlanteans and the early Irish races. Now, certainly there were some stories, there's fact to the idea of the Druidic races doing human sacrifice and things of that nature, but that was far closer to our modern times. When we see the degradation into human sacrifice and things of that nature, and we see a lot of these monuments being built, these are much closer to our time as opposed to older. When you see like old mounds of pyramids existing, and you see feeble attempts to recreate the Great Pyramids, science a lot of times tries to say, well, these feeble attempts, these smaller pyramids, were their original attempts at the Great Pyramids in Giza. That's not actually the case according to esoteric science. In actuality, the smaller pyramids, the more recent ones, are the degraded attempts of a evolutionary people, for the evolution of the people there, to try to recreate what was once great. So the cultural height of Egypt is far gone, but you saw after its great height that the remnants of that race were still trying to recapture that greatness. The impulse, as far as the main cultural push, had moved on from the Egyptians to the Greeks and the Romans at that time. And so you see the transition taking place. And you can also see how intimate those two groups were during that time, and how, by virtue of being in the same area and certain things along those lines, that transition was able to be made from the Egyptian cultural age to the Greco-Roman cultural age, and that transmission of knowledge and understanding that took place along the lines with all that. And so, again, all of this ties into evolution, archaeology, geology, anthropology, all of these sciences, and it does tend to be controversial, the little picture that I'm trying to spin together here, and a little bit maybe new to some folks. But nonetheless, I think that science will come around full circle to a fuller understanding. And I'm not even going to come close to say that I have all the little pieces to fill in all the puzzle either. I'm only able in this hour to give just a little hint here and there and to try to build upon that. And I may well do another show on this subject before the end of the month to kind of fill out and give a bit more detail and speak also specifically about the language and the cultural advances and the high technology that was available through these ancient peoples, the late Lemurians and the more recently to us, the Atlantean ages, and some of what took place during that time. Again, another aspect of the pyramids. We consider the pyramid as man trying to create and pay homage to the divine. The fact that there are pyramids in Central America and that they're in Egypt and all other places show this tie between the ancient civilizations, that the concepts of building and the religious concepts and a lot of things were common among all men, even though they were very widely scattered on the globe. So there are people that are going to look at that certain ways and make their own. They're going to surmise certain things, and there are going to be people that will say other things. But certainly, according to esoteric science, the pyramid builders of all cultural ages were all tied in with the one belief in the one God and very common religious symbolism and significance shared amongst all these groups throughout antiquity, from, again, the earliest times that we became self-conscious. there was some form of teaching, some form of spiritual knowledge available to man, and that's always been the case. So we'd like to go ahead and grab a couple of calls and see what's going on this evening. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Hey, guy.
How's it going?
Pretty good. A first-time watcher and first-time caller. Some interesting subject material. I've got two questions. I'll make it fast. You probably have some other callers to get to. First of all, I don't believe that Jesus was white, and a lot of people say that the first man was found in Africa and was a black skin pigment. And if they have the dominant gene, then where, in your opinion, did white people come from? Do you care to elaborate on that, and I'll get to my second question?
Well, the cultural impulse is going to go through all these different ages at different times. Now, certainly, you may not even put any faith in the fact that there was an Atlantis or a Lemuria, and that these great continents subsided and are no longer really available for us to have records of, for the most part. But the so-called white races didn't spring up until more recent, and as far as following our Aryan races, if you want to do that, it started around, supposedly allegedly around 1 million years ago. But if we want to point to India as the great cultural age initially, and then from that came the Persian age, and then from that came the Babylonian, Chaldean, Hebrew, Egyptian age, and that would have been the third. The fourth would be the Greco-Roman, and the fifth great cultural age, which is the dominant cultural impulse or influence at this time, is the Anglo-Saxon. And people would say white men rule the world right now. Well, in large terms, or in a lot of ways, you can make an argument for that, because visibly it seems as if white people are the domineering culture on the planet right now.
Right. Well, I just meant as far as skin pigment, it's supposed to be the dominant gene to have a dark skin, and so if that was the case, if the first man was
of course,
black,
that's according to regular science, so that there's this dominant, and that's like Darwinian thinking that,
I don't believe in evolution, but...
But that would fall back on a Darwinian concept to say that, pigment and how, maybe these people lived in the sun and so they were dark, or this, that, and the other.
Right, right.
According to esoteric science, the earliest races were yellow, a yellow race, and then the black and everything else came from that. And so supposedly the very early Aboriginal races and the people of that nature and the Samoan races were a bit earlier than some of the so-called African races that, again, sprang from that common area, Lemuria, Atlantis, all that is a seed of civilization, and then it found its way to Africa much later. Okay.
Well, my second question is, it's more so of not so much of a question as much of a call to arms.
Thanks, Chris, for hooking me up there. Hey, you're not a first-time caller then, obviously, my good man. First-time viewer. Okay, anyway, nonetheless, let me go and grab another call quickly. Hello, caller, you're on the air. Hello, caller?
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, I got to turn the TV on because I can't really hear you. Cool topic, by the way.
Thanks.
I happen to know a little bit about this. Are you aware of reptilian beings to any degree?
Well, as far as a reptilian influence, I would say that would be an extra-planetary influence, and that, yes, there is very much ties to us and people from other planets.
As well. Genetically, there are ties?
See, I don't really see us as being genetic slaves or cattle to these reptile races, or any other race for that matter. Because ultimately, you have to at some point ask yourself, if you made us, who made you? And who made them? And who made them? Ultimately, that's why esoteric science is so good, to show comprehensively how on this planet life evolves and how that ties into the larger picture. And so that, yes, there is intercession or communion between the different races on different globes because of our civilization, our evolutionary levels of understanding, and that there are far advanced races out there. But the more advanced of these races don't interfere with what's going on here. They're allowing of our own free will. It is the lesser, older, antiquated mentality of some of these extra cosmic races like the reptilians that are keeping us bound to this new world order concept that the globalists go to. And that's where you can tie in with a David Icke and what he's bringing out, and how these extra cosmic influences came to our planet and stayed, and they far outstayed their welcome. They really are staying here against our free will, and they're breaking the rules, if you will. And so cosmically, they will only be able to pull that off for so long before somebody says, hey, come back to the classroom, get out of that little schoolyard situation.
I think they have sort of the oppressor mentality, whereas we have the victim mentality, and it's kind of a mutual relationship that we have. We feel that we're victims, and they feel that they have to oppress. That's what they get off on. But as far as Lemuria goes, my sources tell me that the reptilians were the original inhabitants of Lemuria, and that dinosaurs were actually their genetic creations, and that they had the ability to genetically engineer dinosaurs, and that's kind of, they, you know, intelligent beings make beings below them that are reflections of their being, and dinosaurs are a reptilian reflection of, you know, them. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I don't know what the purpose would be for making the dinosaurs, though. What's the purpose of creating dinosaurs? You know, I mean, I could see creating humans to mine like lodestone, or to mine diamonds, or mine some kind of fuel, like some people allege that are in the more New Age type movement. But I can't really find the logic for reptilians creating dinosaurs to what ends. You know?
All right, that's a good question. I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't know why they did
And see,
it.
I think that all falls back more so to, again, the genetic manipulation. I don't really subscribe to the genetic manipulation theory for our evolution quite as much. I think there might have been some tinkering down the line. You know, that's pretty likely. But ultimately, the evolutionary flow is a divine flow that works in cycles of 1s, 3s, 7s, 10s, 12s, and you see that repeating itself over and over again throughout nature. And so to say that the reptile aliens were part and parcel of all that as well is giving them a bit too much omnipotence, in my estimation. We're a bit more resourceful, and we're a bit more
to a degree, but it doesn't mean it's not true.
Well, you know, I kind of put those off on the shelf until I can find better evidence to support those as far as the reptile intervention. You know what I mean?
Okay.
I believe that we've had
intervention. Have you read David Icke stuff?
Beg pardon?
Have you read Icke's stuff?
I'm not really that familiar with David Icke. And then when I do read his stuff, I see that he and I seem to be on the same page about a lot of things, but no. But I think that's part of the universal consciousness more so than, you know, anything else, because as little as I read his stuff, and when I do see things from him or hear things from him, and it tends to tie in with what I'm saying, you know, there's something bigger going on behind the scenes than, because I don't talk to David Icke. I've never met him, and I rarely ever read his stuff, or I've never read his books, and visited his website like twice maybe. So, you know, I don't know what to say about that, but appreciate your call. Have a nice evening.
Okay.
Okay. Let me grab another call quickly. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
Hi. About the dodo birds, like, I can sell you some if you want some.
Okay. You know, there are people that, there are what's called anomalies, certainly, and there's a guy named Charles Fort, and there's a whole study called the Fortian study of things that just don't quite fit. And there are some people that do allege that, you know, like there's articles from like the 1800s, for instance, in early newspapers that have pictures of a pterodactyl, for instance, like in Arizona. And you can find on occasion these old pictures and old clippings that allude to, you know, these hangers-on from earlier times. And that might be what a Loch Ness monster is, for instance, things of that nature. I'm still not 100% sure about that. Let me go ahead and grab another call. Hello, caller, you're on the air. Hello, caller?
Hello? Hello?
Yes, hello, you're there?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to urge everyone to call the city council and tell them that you are for, oh, shit.
For or against? Are you talking about the Patriot Act?
Yes.
Do I know who this caller is?
Yes.
Okay. Hey, thanks for calling, Virginia. I'll let you go. But and that's a bit off topic, but yeah, that's you know, that thing's going to fall apart before it's going to collapse under its own weight. I really wouldn't worry about that too much. And I do kind of want to stick to topic a little bit if I can tonight. Although that is kind of part of evolution or de-evolution in a sense. We have to face up to these things eventually. Let me go and grab another call. Hello, caller, you're on the air. Hello, caller.
Yeah, is that me? Okay, here. 이혼아가 누구냐?
Sorry. Okay. Hello, caller, you on the air? Hello, caller.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? Go ahead.
Oh, wow, I almost hung up. I didn't think that I could get through now.
Ha, ha, ha. All right, buddy. Hello, caller, you're on the air. Hello, caller? Hello? Okay, well. Okay, well, let me go ahead and try to, I guess, wrap up and bring a few more points up in this last couple of minutes of the show. There's a pretty decent chance that I'll probably I don't know for sure if I'm going to cover this next week or not. I may try to flesh this out a bit more and speak again more of like the actual layout of how the land was at that time, and get into more aspects of the language as it developed, and the technology that was available to the ancient race of humanity, and that allegedly, supposedly, we had, capacity to have what would be the equivalent of a laser beam or a death ray, and that there were aerial flying vehicles that could fly in the air and also travel underwater at the same time, that were around during the Atlantean days, and then also into the early Indian religious records. Speaking of the Vimana, or the flying craft that allegedly the ancient Indian they had, and they conducted aerial warfare allegedly with these Vimana, these flying ships in ancient India. And again, that's subject to speculation, but I don't know. I think again there is some truth, at least a grain of truth, to every myth or every story, if we can just trace it back to the truth of it. Let's see. And again, considering that Lemuria was the seat of humanity as far as the Garden of Eden is concerned, and that's when we first gained what you would consider humanity as far as our self-consciousness, our individualization, in which each person considers themselves a separate person, although still connected, obviously, to the divine, but nonetheless an individualized person that can go about, their own affairs and think their own thoughts and feel their own feelings and what have you. And so that being the case, and there's a lot more that can be said, and it's difficult to touch on some of these things because, again, the time that it took place in our history was so far ago that a lot of this, it's hard to show substantially that this actually was the case. And so I would just ask people to consider it as a hypothesis at this point until you can get some further corroboration. But there's a bit of information out there available if folks are willing to take a look and see as to the history of man and the history of these ancient civilizations, and also the high state of achievement and the culture that we've achieved in the past. I would like to encourage folks to take the opportunity to check out Jeff Contreras. He's live every Tuesday at 10 on Channel 10, or Therefore I Am. I'd like to remind folks of the meditation meeting. This is the last time I'm going to have a chance to remind folks. So anybody that's interested, please make their way down to the Hancock Library between 7:30 and 8:30, Wednesday, June 11th, for a group meditation that I'll be hosting. And I'd like to ask folks to come down and help out with that. It's completely free, open to the public. I'd like to thank my producer, Chris, for commanding the helm of the Starship Esoterica. And I'll also remind folks that we ourselves are here every Thursday live from 9 to 10 on Channel 10. And then, the third Wednesday of the month will be our metaphysical or philosophical meeting that Jeff Contreras and myself host. And that's upstairs at Opal Divine's, third Wednesday of the month. It'll be June 18th, and it's always free, very casual. Just come upstairs and sit down and have a chat, and we'll go from there. But I want to thank everybody this evening for taking the opportunity to view. Again, I may try to hash this out a bit more the following week and try to explain, hopefully in better detail, some of these events. Again, when you get into evolution and things like that, and you start talking about origins of races, sometimes it tends to ruffle feathers. That's just how it is, and I make no apologies for that. So thanks, Austin. Just think about these things. That's all I have to ask. Just please think, and have a nice evening. Thanks, Austin. Take care.